Welcome to the Empowering Minds Mental Health Podcast. I'm excited to have Brian Sachetta on the show again. Welcome back. It's been almost a year.
Hey,
So,
Jennifer.
Brian has written two great books. They're actually like a volume one, volume two, Get Out of Your Head. And I briefly skimmed some of those books, but the books kind of give like useful tips on how you can stop overthinking and feeling better mentally. So last time I interviewed Brian, we discussed ways to stop negative thoughts. So today we're going to learn more about his work as an author and a coach and how his books and coaching can help people change their lives. All right. All right. So thank you again. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, and I'm glad to be back.
All right. All right. So we're just going to jump right into some questions here. So, in your books, Get Out of Your Head, one and two, what are some of the main topics in your books? And was it a specific audience that you wrote the books for?
Yeah, it might be a somewhat long answer, but I do want to answer all of it. So, two books, right? The
Mhm.
first one, Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. That book, as the title would suggest, is geared towards anxiety and helping folks manage it. I use in the title the word overcome. I think overcoming anxiety is certainly possible. I don't use that word to say like vanquish it entirely and never have anxiety again. It's more, and a lot of people in the space will put it this way, is to be able to reframe anxiety, to see it in a different way where it doesn't own your life anymore, right? To be able to harness it in a different fashion to make sense of it. And
Mhm.
that is the overcoming piece, right? Because if you talk to, let's say, a professional athlete, even a star athlete, a lot of them will say, you know what? I still get really nervous before games, before the big games, before all of them.
Yeah.
And the lesson there, right, is not, hey, if you want to be successful, you can't have any anxiety, right? It's like listen to your mentors, your heroes, whatever. A lot of them still have that anxiety. The difference is that they have found a way to harness it and potentially use it for some positive force, right? So if that is in the athletic field, maybe it's realizing that that anxious energy is still energy. And if you can channel it in the right way, it might lead to a better performance, more energy, more, what's the right word? I don't know, just the ability to run faster, jump higher, all that stuff.
Mhm.
So the focus of the first book is helping folks overall rechannel their anxiety, look at it in different ways. And that book is split into two parts. So the first part, at the moment, I call it zooming in. I'm focusing on just a little context here. I have been working on a rewrite of that book or a second edition of that book. So some of the terms may change a little bit, but the first half, as it stands today, is called zooming in. And so what I'm focusing on in that first half of the book is let's look at acute situations, right? You are stressed right now. You are anxious right now. You're feeling that fear. How are some, excuse me, what are some ways that you can walk that fear back in real time, that you can make sense of it in real time so it doesn't continue to run your life? And then the second half of the book is called zooming out at the moment, and it's more okay, let's take a higher level look at anxiety itself.
Mhm.
Let's ask ourselves, where might anxiety come from? So if the first half of the book is how do we get ourselves out of anxiety provoking situations or situations where we are anxious, the second half of the book is more asking how do we get into fewer of those situations and feelings in the first place. So it's looking at our habits, the way that we live our lives, so our lifestyles and routines and all that. In the end, right? I guess the overall vibe of the book is, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a doctor, so I don't pretend to know everything. I don't pretend to be able to diagnose and treat, and legally I can't do those things. But my unique contribution to the space and to readers is I guess I will say unique, even though it's, a lot of us go through a journey like this, but my own journey of dealing with anxiety, learning things that helped me, and then sharing those stories in hopefully a relatable fashion that allows folks to be like, oh, I'm a little curious about that, right? Brian said something that resonated with me. That story struck a chord where I could relate to something in it, and hopefully that piece where they're able to relate to allows them to make a little space in their mind for some of these ideas and hopefully try them on, so to speak, in their own life. So that's the first book. Any questions on that you want to go further into?
No, this is good. I'm writing some stuff down. Yeah, this is
Okay,
good. Keep going.
great. So let's talk about the second book, and then I'll answer the question about the audience as
Okay.
well. So the second book is called Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. So,
Mm-hmm.
as that title would suggest, that book is focused on helping folks manage depression.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the difficulty, I think, right, with a subject like depression and managing it in general is that it's an all consuming, not that anxiety's not or can't be, but depression, right? It's like when we think about examples of depression, when we talk to folks who are depressed, there are folks who are so depressed they can't get out of bed, right? I would call that all consuming. And
Mm-hmm.
even if you are not experiencing some condition or some version of depression where you can't get out of bed each day, there's still that almost black cloud that hangs over you, right? It infuses into everything that you do. It's always there until it goes
Mm-hmm.
away. And so my approach with the second book was one to bring more empathy because I like
Yeah.
even though anxiety is very difficult and there's some empathy in the first book, when you're in that depressive state, in that pit of despair, so to speak, I mean, goodness gracious, that is a really, really tough place to be. And
Yeah.
you can be there for a long time, right? So often what you need is somebody that is kind of on the journey with you or walking side by side with you and someone who is able to offer perspectives that, maybe they don't necessarily land right now, but they give you the motivation and the inspiration to keep going. So that is kind of the overall theme of the second book. In that book, right? It's not just me kind of throwing fluff at the reader. I bring a lot of research into the manuscript itself, and so I'm talking about research studies that show how we act in certain situations when we are depressed. Talking about some science behind how depression can arise. So one of the things that and forgive me if I'm answering a question that might be coming down the line, but to make a nice connection between the two books, there's a study that I cite in the second book, saying how a lot of people will often say that anxiety and depression are like two peas in a pod. Another way of saying that is that they are comorbid diseases in the sense that if you deal with anxiety, the likelihood that you deal with depression or may deal with depression is going to be higher than the average person in the population who does not experience or deal with anxiety, right? And vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And so that study in the book, and the point I was trying to make was that so if anxiety and depression are two peas in a pod, then most likely they have some way of linking to one another, or
Yeah.
another way of saying this is one can lead to the other. And
Mm-hmm.
so, not that depression can't lead back to anxiety, but a really common path is anxiety leading to depression, right? So, if we think about this just in a plain sense, right? You're scared all the time, you're nervous all the time. It happens, it happens, it happens, it happens. Eventually, you get to the point where you're so scared all the time and you're not really making that progress or you're not alleviating that fear that you eventually just throw your hands up, right? And you say, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do. Nothing, I don't think anything's going to work here. Why even try? And so that's like, if we talk about what depression is, depression is virtually a pervasive state of helplessness and hopelessness in the mind and in the body, right? And when we proverbially throw up our hands and say, why even try? We are essentially taking on those I wouldn't say traits, but we are embodying hopelessness and embodying helplessness. And that's not a judgment, right? I'm not trying to say
Right.
to somebody that that is not a reasonable reaction, because often it is. At the same time, right? The world is very stressful. There's a lot of things that go on in our lives that can really push us in that direction. So in the second book, I take a look at, okay, what is depression? Where does it come from? If these various stressors in our lives are, making us very anxious and then leading back to depression, how can we reframe some of those things? How can we change our lives such that we don't find ourselves falling into that pit of despair so often. So that's a summation of both books. The market, I guess, or the my audience. I think about the fact that I and again, I don't say this to self-aggrandize or anything like that, but I think about the journey that I went on of, being 17, being 18, being so anxious that like I didn't know what to do with myself. And again, it's not to say that I don't experience anxiety every once in a while now. It's just that things are a little bit different, right? I have some of these tools on my side that help me get by.
Hmm.
And so I think back to that journey and, it's ongoing in some ways, but I've made a lot of progress. And I think about there was really a defining decade, if you will, of probably 17 or 18 to 27/28, my age. And so, I guess full transparency, I'm 34 now, but those ages that was kind of the range where I felt
Hmm.
like I banged my head against the wall for a really long time, and then eventually on the other, towards the end of that window, started to make a lot of progress. So I think about, right, I essentially wrote the book in some ways for myself, right, as a cathartic process to be like,
Hmm.
here's what I feel I went through, here's what I feel helped me, here's how I can sum this all up and say, this makes some sense to me now. So, from that perspective, right, the audience, the folks that it's going to resonate most with, is probably folks in that range. And I will say, I think the range can extend a little bit. So, I tend to say, it probably skews male. And the age range is somewhere around 18 to 35. Everybody's on their own journey. Everybody, deals with these things in different fashions. At the same time, right? I would say that no disrespect to anybody who's older, right? But just the stories are probably not going to be as relatable to a 70-year-old as they will to a
Hmm.
19-year-old. So that's the audience there. And to be honest, right, if I get a bunch of messages from folks on social media and email and stuff like that, and you can kind of tell, like somebody will say, "Hey, I'm in high school, I'm in college, I'm struggling with this." So there's sort of a pattern there around the age of folks that reach out to me.
Okay. So this is some good information. I'm really proud of like all of your progress and your resilience. And so as someone who has dealt with, or I still deal with from time to time, issues with anxiety and depression, books that you have written are a part of my, what I like to call my coping skills toolbox, right? And so I know everything doesn't work for everyone. So I work in mental health as a peer support specialist. So generally what I try to do, I try to teach, well, first I have a conversation to kind of see things that the client that they may really like. And then I will develop some coping skills around um, anxiety, depression, or whatever the diagnosis may be. But yeah, I'm really excited about your book, and I think this is something that I'll share with my management team, something we can have on file as a resource.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that'll be awesome. Okay, so we've talked about your book, and I also know that you do some coaching. And I don't want to assume, so I want to ask you, what type of coaching do you offer, and what do you concentrate on when you're offering your coaching sessions?
Yeah. So, how I like to talk about it, right? Kind of two main pieces. One is because I'm not a doctor and I can't diagnose and I
Right.
can't treat. It's a little like I cannot call it therapy, and I don't make it seem like it is therapy.
Hmm.
Instead, I try to tailor it in two ways. So the first is basically saying, all right, there's a bunch of tools that are in book one and book two, and so let's try to apply some of those tools to the coaching students' life in a way that I think would be relevant to their current situation. So we might
Hmm.
go through, for example, like the CBT triangle or something that like that, which is
Okay.
essentially a tool that helps folks draw conclusions between their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions, right?
Hmm.
And so that just as to play on this example a little bit more, right? Somebody may, come out of a situation and be like, "Oh, it went so horribly, XYZ, I was so anxious, whatever." So I would just kind of in these coaching calls, I might say, "Hey, let's just pick that apart a little bit," right? So, for example, like you were at a job interview or what have you, and you felt this certain way. So, question for you, right, is like, what was going through your mind this entire time? Were you thinking about, positive thoughts or negative thoughts? Did you have, something nagging in the back of your mind saying, you're no good or whatever it may be? Like, where was your head at, right? And then as you turned those thoughts over, how did those thoughts make you feel, right? And it's not rocket science, but often, right, it's just the ability to have somebody to play off of with this process, right? Because it can be a little bit difficult for us to do it ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
especially because like one thing that people say about coaching is that sometimes we say to ourselves like, "Oh, I'm smart and I'm successful. I don't need a coach."
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with your success or lack of success. It actually has to do with the fact that the brain has a lot of biases built into it, right? So we cannot see outside of ourselves. And so there's a lot of times, right, where it's like you may be talking to a friend or whatever, and you're like, "Hey, you do that thing a lot," and they're like, "What thing? I don't do that." And you're like, that's the essence of what I'm talking about here. Whereas somebody on the outside sees things that the person themselves cannot see, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not a judgment thing. It's more to say, "Hey, this is going on," or "I see this." You might not see this, and therefore, if it's in your periphery or if it's in your blind spot, let's figure out a way to deal with this, to talk about it, because this might actually help you make some progress. So I know I jumped around a little bit there, but closing out the CBT triangle is to say like, okay, so you had certain thoughts in a certain situation, they made you feel a certain way, and then as a result, how did you act, right? If you felt scared or if you felt empowered or whatever it may be, what did that then push you to do and say in that situation? And then you start to see that it's sort of, oh, sorry, I just hit my microphone. Yeah, there's sort of a progression there, right? Where it's like, okay, we think certain ways, we feel certain ways as a result, and then we tend to act certain ways as another result. And then it can kind of cycle back and forth, right? So you get a certain result, and then you think certain thoughts as a result of that, and then you feel, and so on and so forth. And so that's just one example of like maybe an exercise that we might run through in the coaching. And as it applies to anxiety, right, is okay, if somebody says, I was in a job interview, I was really nervous, I kept telling myself, like, oh, it's not good to be nervous. I
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be having these feelings and these thoughts right now. I'm no good at this. Then I want to like work with that person to say, okay, where did that belief come from? Or where did those thoughts emanate?
Mm-hmm.
Why might you feel, like you are XYZ? And then we break that down and kind of try to figure out where that person is coming to the coaching session from. What kind of headspace are they in, and what can we map their psyche a little bit and figure out what's going on in there? And that leads me to the second part of coaching, which is essentially, right, like, so I talked about blind spots, and it's like, what if you work with a coach, right? It's like, okay, why would you hire a personal trainer, right? You may do that because you have certain goals, certain benchmarks, metrics, whatever that you want to hit. Maybe you want to lose a few pounds. Maybe you want to put on a little bit of muscle. Maybe you just want to show up to the gym every day, and having a coach holds you accountable, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So in the coaching, like most of it, a good chunk of it, because right, it's like we can only talk about so many tactics before we run out of things to talk about. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, like that can get a little boring, or at least the application can run dry, right? So really, the goal of coaching is like, all right, somebody comes to me in a specific place in their lives, and they say, I want to get to this other place, right? I want to land a new job, I want to land a relationship, whatever it may be. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to help them figure out, one, what are some of the steps that you need to take in order to get there, and then two, what are some of the things that are holding you back from getting there, whether it's taking action, or something that's going on in your head of a belief that's holding you back, or whatever. So that is the coaching process. The goal, right, is so that like I want to make it such that folks can feel as though like something is actually happening. They are actually getting a result out of the coaching. And the main way to measure that is to look at those goals and say like, all right, 3 months ago you were here, today you are here. Do you feel as though you are progressing toward that thing? If not, why not? And let's figure that out. And if you got there, maybe what next goal do you have? And let's try to work on that.
Okay. So now that we've covered about your books and your coaching services, how can people find your books and more information on how to contact you if they may want coaching services?
Yep. So I'd say the best place to find all the information and contact form would be my website. So that's getoutofyourhead.com. There is on the website, there's a coaching page slash tab at the top. Click on that and then you'll see the information there. There's a way to reach out for more information about the coaching services. So, it's like I try to meet people where they are in the sense
Mhm.
that obviously it's like, hey, I offer these services and I spend my time doing it, so I do get compensated for it. But if somebody's like, "Hey, I want to have one call and see where it goes," or I want to just sign up for a lot of calls, like we can be flexible and figure out what makes sense for you.
Okay. All right. So, um, I was wondering if you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share for the viewers who will watch this later on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess um, I'd love to provide some I I'm tempted to say actionable knowledge, but even just like something to take away from here, right?
Yes.
Um, Somebody's dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression. Like, what are some things that they could chew over? I know that we had come up with a list of questions before,
Mhm.
and we were concerned about maybe repeating some questions. Did you have any specific for your audience that maybe they're curious about, or that you hear a lot in your practice, or should I just try to jump into something?
You can just jump in. I don't have any specific questions.
Okay, cool. So, one thing we probably talked about last time, but I think it's worth repeating, is a concept that I bring up in the first book. So it's this notion that I talk about called state management. And so I I came up with this concept, or at the very least, I borrowed it from my professional working life. So I'm a software developer by trade, and in software development, right? So you may have let's just say you have either a computer or a software application that sits on the computer.
Mhm.
The way that those, I guess, computers or applications are built is on this concept called a state machine diagram. And so what I'm going to try to break that down, right? So essentially, let's say you're playing like a slot machine video game. The game itself, even though we play and we're like, hey, we just pull the lever and everything goes or whatever,
Mhm.
um, the game itself, right? It's written in code, and there has to be ways for the application to know exactly what's going on, to track the different phases of the gameplay, right? And so, in a lot of ways, we could say that video games and computer applications sit on top of, or are built on top of, or are built as representations of state machine diagrams. So let's break that down and say, what does that mean? So a state, right, is sort of a configuration or a current spot at which an application or an object currently lives. So, sometimes we say that we are in different emotional states. Maybe we're hungry, maybe we're thirsty, maybe
Mhm.
we're tired. The equivalent on the computer would be if we're playing a slot machine video game, right? It's like when we open the game and we haven't done anything yet, there may be a state or a configuration of the game, right? In the sense that because we have not interacted yet with the slot machine, maybe that state is called like zero state, or like coin not inserted state, right? And then at some
Mhm.
point we take an action where we put a coin into the slot machine, and the computer says, okay, I now need to remember that I have a coin inside of me, right? Um, I'll kind of finalize the process, and then I'll get to what this means for mental
Okay.
health. And so, eventually it's like, okay, then we're in the coin inserted state. We pull the lever, and the machine acts in a certain way because we have put money into it, right?
Mhm.
If we had not put money into it and we tried to pull the lever, maybe the lever doesn't work, maybe an error message shows, or something like that. So essentially, right, is these state machine diagrams are mapping out the behavior of software applications across their life cycle. So when they are in certain, I hate to use the word state in the definition, so I'm going to try to find a different word. But when they are in certain configurations, they're going to act in certain ways, right? And so
Mhm.
if we zoom this back out and we say, okay, what is a state machine diagram? We know that it powers software applications, and then we'll get to the mental health part. Is a state machine diagram is essentially a map that draws out all the different states that a software application could get into or out of, and then it also shows you how that software application can get into or out of those various states. And the last thing it does is it shows you how that machine, or sorry, that that software application operates in those states.
Mhm.
And so it's really like just it's a guide to the full behavior of a system. And so I know it's kind of complicated, it's very technical, that sort of thing, but I write a lot of software as part of my full-time job. And there was a point in my life where I was like, huh, I feel like there is application here to my own mental states, you know? So I at some point I said to myself, all right, I am entering different emotional states across the course of my day. I think I kind of said it earlier, right? But a different example is
Mhm.
sometimes I'm sleepy, sometimes I'm anxious, sometimes I'm tired, sometimes I'm sad. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted to say, okay, if anxiety is a state, if I sometimes get anxious, then there must be things that I do to slide into that anxious state. And then when I am anxious, I must, according, if this theory holds, I must act in certain ways that keep
Mhm.
me in that state, or at the very least are indicative of the fact that I'm in it. And then lastly, because it's a state machine diagram, and we're going to assume that no state is impossible to get into or out of. I also was like, hey, if I can be anxious, but then I also can not be anxious, there must be ways that I get out of this state. And so eventually what I did was I said to myself, okay, I need to basically draw a state machine diagram for some of my emotions. I'm going to say, the mental health related ones, not
Mhm.
all of them. But then I'm also going to, so let me kind of jump back here for a second. I started this ramble with the notion of state management, and so state management, right, is the notion that we have our state machine diagrams. We know how we get into and out of and act in all the different states. State management is applying some agency to the process to say, all right, I have the map. I now understand that I'm in state A or state B or state C. It is my responsibility, or I am taking it upon myself to actively usher myself in and out of the states that I want to be in or out of. And so putting that all together, right, is saying, let's bring a little bit of agency to our own mental health. And so when we are feeling anxious or when we are feeling depressed, what are some of the things that we can do to help ourselves feel a little bit better or get out of that state? And then also, what are some of the things that we do when we're in those states that are indicative of those things? So, as a concrete example, right, I sometimes on podcasts or in my writing, I talk about my own state machine, and I say, when I am anxious, I ruminate a lot. And one of the funny things is, I think a lot of people have done a lot of ruminating over the course of their lives, but it's funny because my brain and a lot of other people's brains are still wired and conditioned to say, hey, if you keep ruminating, you'll eventually figure this thing out, right? This emotion that
Mhm.
you're struggling with. You'll get to the other side of it, you'll solve it, you'll get out of it. And one of the things that was a really big breakthrough for me, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, was this understanding, and sometimes I do better with it than others, but this understanding that you can't solve anxiety, right? You can't think it through. There's a couple times where you're like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm making too big a deal out of this and I should drop this. But, 95% of the time, it's just an emotion, right? And the more that you chew over that emotion, the stronger it grows, the larger it grows, and all that. And so it was a practice for me to be able to say, like, all right, I need to figure out how I operate when I'm in these states. And then I also want to use that information to help myself moving forward. So I invite folks who have read the book or, listen to a podcast where I talk about this concept to find that agency in their own lives, right? To draw that state machine diagram for themselves, and then to use it, right? To be able to say, okay, the next time I get into an anxious state, let me pull that thing out and figure out what some of the tactics are that help me move out of that anxious state and so forth. So that a little long-winded, but that's a really core concept in the first book. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize there is just the fact that even though anxiety is really hard, um, anxiety is a state, right? Because we go through these ups and downs where it's like over the course of a day, you might be anxious for an hour and then you get out of it. You might be anxious the whole day and maybe the next day you're not. And I'm not trying to make light of it. It's very challenging. At the same time, it shows you that it is transient on some level. So we're trying to lean into those state machine diagrams and bring that transience forward a little bit more.
Okay. This is so good. I never thought about it in that way, but I'm gonna draw a little diagram in my journal. So kind of like when I feel this way, maybe these are some things that I can do. I'm very visual, so this would be good for me to just kind of have. I usually kind of carry a journal with me everywhere I go. So this will be helpful for me to even have at work. Like today, I don't know, just all of a sudden I just became a little overwhelmed and anxious. And I was like, what in the world? So I was like, you know what? Maybe if I just get up from my desk and just walk like 5 or 10 minutes, that'll be helpful. And so by the time I walked and I came back, I was okay. But there's some days that wouldn't have helped me at all. So I just kind of have to figure out the niche. So
That's
okay.
awesome. Yeah, and I guess last thing I want to say on this point is you made me think of this. So awareness is very difficult to have when your mind is swirling, right?
Yeah.
We might know a lot of these tactics um, on some rational level, but
Hmm.
when we get really anxious is when it becomes hard to put these things into practice. And so, you having that list or somebody having their state machine diagram, I'm not saying that it's all of a sudden going to be a walk in the park,
Right.
but if you have that accessible, right, and you let's say you have it on your desk or something, then you get into that anxious state. It's right there, and it's like, oh, I don't even have to brainstorm these different tactics because they're
Yeah.
sitting there in front of me. I point at one, I go try it on for size, and I see where that gets me. So it helps shortcut the fact that the awareness is so hard to find when our minds get rolling.
Yeah, that is so good. Okay. Well, Brian, thank you for coming on. Oh, I do want to ask you, do you mind if I share your website? I'm going to put the link information in on YouTube and my different platforms just in case people want to reach out to you for coaching. And on your website, they can get your books on the website as well. And some
Yep.
merchandise,
Y-
t-shirts and different things.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
there's some merch
Gotcha.
there. Yeah, I mean, like the books and the merch will link out to third party sellers or whatever,
Okay.
Amazon, and then a t-shirt fulfiller or a site that I mean it's all sorts of you can get a sweatshirt if you want and stuff like that.
Okay.
So just a third party merchant. So yeah, I mean
Okay,
I would
great.
never turn down free marketing. So yeah, I would certainly
Okay.
appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I will be in touch with you soon. And again, thank you so much. It's good to see you again.
Likewise, really good
All
to see you,
right.
Jennifer.
Take care.
Okay,
Have a good
bye.
one. Thanks.